There's a pattern in history that has quietly decided who gets to rule the world for the last 300 years, and it has nothing to do with flags, speeches, or the size of an army on paper. It comes down to one simple question: who controls the fuel that keeps civilization running? Not who uses it, not who discovers it, but who can decide who gets it and who doesn't. Who can flip a switch and slow an enemy's economy to a crawl? Who can force entire nations to accept terms they hate because the alternative is national bankruptcy? 4 times in modern history, a country, or a small club of countries, has gained near monopoly control over the resource that powered its era. Each time, that control created a superpower. In the 1800s, Britain sat on the world's coal mine. Coal was the engine of the Industrial Revolution. Every factory line, every rail line, every steamship drank coal like oxygen. Britain had it in mountains. Everyone else needed it. The result was the largest empire in human history, administered not just with red-coated troops, but with black dust pulled from the ground. In the 1900s, that black dust was replaced by black liquid. Oil became the blood of the modern world. Every car, every plane, every tank, every mechanized army depended on it. America rose as the country that not only discovered huge oil fields, but also built an entire civilization around them. Cheap gasoline, endless highways, global war machines running on American crude. That is how the United States became the 20th century's dominant power. In the 1970s, something shifted. The United States still had oil, but it no longer had enough. Saudi Arabia and a small group of producers realized they didn't need to own all the wells. They just needed to control enough of them to set the price for everyone else. Through OPEC, they put their hand on the global throttle. Prices went from $3 a barrel to $40 in less than a decade. Western economies were smashed into recession. The petrodollar world was born. The nations that had once dictated terms learned what it meant to be dependent. And now, in the 21st century, in a world wired by microchips and powered by magnets, a new resource has stepped into the role: rare earth elements. The 17 exotic metals most people can't name but can't live without are the invisible skeleton of modern technology. Every smartphone, every computer, every electric vehicle motor, every advanced missile, every stealth jet relies on them. And one country, China, has spent 3 decades quietly cornering not just the mining, but the processing, the step that actually turns rock into usable power. Today, they control roughly 90% of that bottleneck. Without rare earths, the modern world doesn't just slow down, it stops. This is the story of how control over a single strategic resource can bend the planet around it, how Britain rode coal to global dominance, how America turned oil into empire, how Saudi Arabia and OPEC weaponized dependence, and how China is positioning rare earths as a new kind of superweapon, one that doesn't explode, but without which nothing else can move. The pattern that connects these stories is unnervingly similar every time: discovery, development, monopoly, dependency, leverage, collapse. 6 stages, 4 case studies, and right now with China we are deep into stage 5, the leverage phase, where the monopoly is already in place, the world is already dependent, and exit routes are narrow, expensive, and painfully slow. Before we walk through those stages one by one, we need to be precise about what a strategic resource monopoly actually is. It is not simply owning a lot of something. It is the ability to control the flow. Think of it less like owning water and more like owning the only pipes that deliver it to a thirsty city. Strategic resources share 3 brutal characteristics. First, they are essential. A civilization cannot function at its current level without them. In the 1800s, no coal meant no industrial revolution, no mechanized factories, no railways to move goods and troops, no steamships to cross oceans on schedule, no cheap iron, no power grid.
In the 1900s, no oil meant no internal combustion engines, no mass car ownership, no global aviation, no armored divisions, and no petrochemical industry making everything from plastics to fertilizers. Today, without rare earth elements, we lose the core components of our digital and green energy infrastructure. No high-performance magnets, no powerful EV motors, no efficient wind turbines, no high-brightness screens, no precision guidance systems. Second, they are effectively non-substitutable at scale, at least for decades at a time. You cannot run industrial steam engines on wood and expect to power an empire. You cannot fly a jet fighter on coal dust. You cannot manufacture a smartphone or an F-35's radar using random metals from the periodic table. The physics simply don't cooperate. The technology is tailored around very specific materials, and retooling takes time, money, and breakthroughs that cannot be scheduled. Third, these resources are geographically concentrated. They are not evenly sprinkled across the planet in easy-to-reach form. A few regions have deposits dense enough and shallow enough to be economically extracted. Even more importantly, only a few states are willing to pay the political, environmental, and financial cost of building the infrastructure to exploit them. When one nation captures both the deposits and the value chain, from mine to market, it doesn't just become a major exporter, it becomes the gatekeeper. With that gatekeeping role comes three kinds of power. Economic power, the ability to set prices, to decide how much supply reaches the market, to extract wealth from importers simply because they have no alternative. Military power, the ability to keep its own war machine fueled while starving an opponent's, to turn enemy tanks and jets run dry without firing a single bullet, to turn resource flows into silent blockades. Political power, the ability to say, align with our interests or we turn the tap. That is leverage, and in geopolitics, leverage is often more decisive than raw firepower. 4 times in modern history, a country or a small club of countries has gained near monopoly control over the resource that powered its era. Each time, that control created a superpower. To see where we are today, we have to go back to where the pattern began. Britain, early 1800s, coal. Before the Industrial Revolution, the human species lived on what economists call a muscle-powered economy. Human backs, animal muscle, windmills, and water wheels provided the energy budget. Production was limited by calories and weather. Wealth grew slowly, if at all. Then came the realization that the black rock lying under English hillsides could be turned into mechanical work. Coal was dense, portable sunlight, millions of years of stored energy ignited in seconds. Burn it, boil water, create steam, spin pistons, and suddenly machines could do what human muscles never could.
One steam engine replaced 100 workers. One locomotive pulled more freight than entire caravans of horses. One steamship made sailing schedules reliable, not hostage to wind and currents. Coal was the accelerant that transformed a mercantile island kingdom into the workshop of the world. Britain had been blessed, or cursed depending on your view, with enormous coal seams close to the surface, especially in places like northern England, Wales, and Scotland. By 1800, it was already pulling out around 10 million tons a year. By 1850, that number had multiplied to about 50 million. By 1900, it had quadrupled again to over 200 million tons. But the raw tonnage wasn't the only advantage. Britain turned coal into a system. It built coal-fired factories that mass-produced textiles, iron rails, and machinery. It laid down coal-fed railways that stitched together its domestic market. It launched steamships that carried its goods and its gunboats to every coastline on Earth. Industrialization is not just about inventing machines. It's about building networks of mines, ports, mills, and financial systems that can support them for generations. Britain did that first and did it at scale, creating what historians sometimes call a 50-year industrial head start. The payoff was staggering.
Economically, British factories could flood world markets with goods that were both cheaper and higher quality than those made with traditional methods. The phrase "made in Britain" became synonymous with industrial prowess. By the mid-19th century, Britain was responsible for more than half of global coal output, a similarly dominant share of iron, and a massive slice of global textile production. It became the planet's manufacturing hub, and other nations paid for admission. Militarily, coal allowed Britain to upgrade its navy from sails and wooden hulls to ironclads and steel steamships. Steam power freed the Royal Navy from the tyranny of wind patterns. Coal bunkers replaced billowing sails, and with coaling stations scattered along key trade routes, Gibraltar, Malta, Suez, Aden, Bombay, Singapore, Cape Town, British warships could refuel around the world. By the 1880s, the Royal Navy's coal-powered fleet was the largest and most advanced on Earth, ensuring that global trade usually sailed under the shadow of British guns. Politically, this coal network meant that any rival wanting to project naval power globally needed access to coaling stations, and those stations were under British influence. Control of fuel routes became a quiet veto on other nations' ambitions. By 1900, the British Empire governed roughly a quarter of the world's land surface and some 400 million people. School books talk about law, language, and institutions. In the engine room, it was coal. But no monopoly lasts forever. Geological luck is rarely exclusive, and technology moves on. Other countries, especially Germany and the United States, discovered their own coal and industrialized rapidly. At the same time, a new strategic resource was emerging: oil. Coal had powered the 19th century. Oil would fuel the 20th. America's story begins in 1859 in Titusville, Pennsylvania, when Edwin Drake drilled the first commercially successful oil well. At first, the product was simply a better lamp fuel, a substitute for expensive whale oil. No one looking at those early derricks imagined aircraft carriers or interstate highways. But then engineers perfected the internal combustion engine. Suddenly, oil wasn't just lighting homes, it was turning wheels, propellers, and blades. Gasoline engines made cars practical. Diesel engines transformed trucks and ships. Even navies began to consider switching from coal to oil for faster, more efficient warships. By the 1920s, it was clear. Oil was no longer just useful, it was essential. And the United States was swimming in it. Massive fields in Pennsylvania, Texas, Oklahoma, and California gave America an extraordinary position. By 1920, it produced around 60% of the world's oil. It could supply domestic demand, fuel industrial expansion, and still export. Crucially, the United States didn't just pump oil, it built an entire civilization around it. Refineries to process it, pipelines to move it, refueling networks to distribute it, car culture and sprawling suburbs that assumed gasoline would always be cheap and abundant. Then came World War II, the moment when oil's strategic nature became impossible to ignore. Germany's tanks blitzed Europe, but routinely ran into fuel shortages. The Nazi push towards the Caucasus in 1942 was not random ambition, it was a desperate dash for Soviet oil fields. They failed, and the Eastern Front ground them down. Japan, an island nation with virtually no oil, faced an embargo in 1941. Deprived of fuel, Japanese leaders saw a shrinking horizon for their empire. Their response, attacking Pearl Harbor to try to secure Southeast Asian oil, was at its core a gamble for energy security. They lost. Throughout the war, American wells, refineries, and logistics lines pumped out vast quantities of fuel. The United States not only powered its own military, but also sent fuel to the British, the Soviets, and other allies. Armies march on their stomachs, but modern armies also march on their fuel tanks, and in that metric, the Allies had a towering advantage. By 1945, the United States had demonstrated what Britain had learned a century earlier. Control of the key energy source is worth more than any single weapon system. In the decades that followed, American oil dominance translated into what came to be called the American Century. At one point after the war, the U.S. still supplied close to half of global oil output. Cheap gasoline underpinned the explosion of car ownership, suburbia, and the highway system. Economically, the country rode a wave of mass consumption, with oil quietly baked into every product's transport cost and every citizen's commute. Militarily, the U.S. built a global presence: aircraft carriers, bomber fleets, far-flung bases, all powered by oil it largely controlled. Politically, this dominance was institutionalized through arrangements like the Bretton Woods system, where the dollar became the world's reserve currency. Countries held dollars in part because they needed them to buy oil, priced in dollars. Energy and finance intertwined. But geology and mathematics eventually caught up. By around 1970, U.S. conventional oil production peaked. Domestic wells could no longer keep up with rising consumption. The country that once exported oil now had to import increasing volumes from abroad, especially the Middle East. That shift turned the resource that had made America strong into a point of vulnerability. Into that gap stepped Saudi Arabia and its partners. The Saudi kingdom had discovered enormous oil reserves in the 1930s, but only in the 1950s and 60s did production scale dramatically, aided by Western technology and capital. By 1970, Saudi output had climbed to several million barrels a day. Individually, no producer had America's old share, but together, a handful of countries realized they held enough of the spigot to control global pricing. In 1960, 5 countries, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Venezuela, founded OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. The idea was simple but radical: coordinate production to influence prices instead of leaving each country to flood or starve the market alone. For a while, the world barely noticed. Then, in October 1973, the Yom Kippur War erupted. Israel fought Egypt and Syria. The United States resupplied Israel. In response, Arab members of OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, cut oil shipments to the U.S. and several other Western nations. Overnight, energy became an explicit weapon. Prices quadrupled from around $3 to $12. Then, after further shocks like the 1979 Iranian Revolution, surged towards $40. The impact on Western economies was brutal. Gas lines snaked through cities. Governments imposed rationing. Inflation soared as every product that required transport or petrochemical inputs became more expensive. Stagflation, high inflation plus high unemployment, haunted the 1970s. Stock markets languished.
The post-war assumption of endless, cheap energy died in a few short years. For OPEC, the leverage translated into enormous wealth. Countries that had been relatively poor saw torrents of petrodollars flood in. Saudi Arabia, in particular, transformed from a desert monarchy into one of the wealthiest states on earth, using oil revenue to fund infrastructure, welfare, religious exports, and sovereign wealth funds. Politically, the U.S. and its allies realized they had to treat oil-rich states not just as suppliers, but as strategic partners, whether they liked their domestic politics or not. Security guarantees were exchanged for stable oil flows. Wars and interventions in the region, while never about a single factor, were always shadowed by the need to keep energy routes open. OPEC never owned all of the world's oil, but it owned enough to move the price, and that was enough to rearrange geopolitics. The oil crises taught a harsh lesson. Dependence on someone else's strategic resource is not an inconvenience, it is a structural vulnerability. That lesson should have burned itself into memory. Yet half a century later, the world has walked straight into a new version of the same trap. This time, the resource is harder to see, buried not just in the ground, but inside every piece of advanced technology we touch. Rare earth elements. People hear the name and assume they are exotic, scattered in tiny amounts. In truth, rare earths are fairly common in the Earth's crust. What makes them rare is the difficulty of mining and separating them economically, and the willingness to tolerate the environmental damage that comes with it. These 17 metals, names like neodymium,
Dysprosium, lanthanum, europium, terbium have unusual magnetic, optical, and chemical properties. Those quirks of physics make them indispensable to our era. High-strength permanent magnets that keep their performance at high temperatures, neodymium and dysprosium. The vivid reds and greens of LED and LCD screens, europium and terbium. High-quality camera lenses and hybrid vehicle batteries, lanthanum. Catalytic converters that strip pollutants from exhaust, cerium. Efficient lasers, precision guidance systems, advanced radar, fiber optic communications, and medical imaging devices all rely on one or more rare earth elements. Modern militaries, in particular, are addicted to them. An F-35 fighter jet contains hundreds of kilograms of rare earths in its electronics, actuators, and sensors. A nuclear-powered submarine uses even more across its systems. Smart bombs, long-range missiles, and secure communication networks all depend on rare earth-based components. Strip those out, and a 21st century army looks like one from the mid-20th century, or worse. Back in the 1980s and early 1990s, the United States actually led in rare earth production. The Mountain Pass mine in California supplied much of the world, but the industry was messy, polluted, and, compared to rivals, expensive. As environmental regulations tightened and global trade liberalized, a new player stepped forward: China. Chinese deposits in Inner Mongolia and other regions, combined with lower labor costs and looser environmental enforcement, made production cheap. But China didn't just compete on extraction. Its government recognized earlier than most the strategic value of controlling the entire chain. Beijing subsidized mining, funded processing plants, and tolerated pollution that would be politically impossible in Western democracies. As Western firms sought cheaper inputs, they naturally turned to Chinese suppliers. Gradually, domestic producers elsewhere shut down. By the early 2000s, China had captured the majority of global market share. By 2010, it was responsible for around 97% of rare earth production. Even today, after some diversification, China still mines the majority and, more importantly, processes more than 90% of rare earth materials into usable oxides, metals, and magnets. That processing step is the choke point. You can dig ore out of the ground in the US or Australia, but most of it still has to be shipped to China to be turned into something factories can use. The result is a dependency more extreme than oil ever was. The US depends on China for roughly 80% of its rare earth imports. Europe's dependence is even higher. Japan, a high-tech powerhouse, is almost completely reliant. These figures are not just about trade ratios, they represent the ability or inability to manufacture core technologies. When one country controls the refineries, separation plants, and magnet factories, it controls the tap. China has already shown glimpses of how it can use this. In 2010, during a diplomatic clash with Japan over disputed islands, Chinese authorities quietly restricted rare earth exports to Japanese buyers. Prices spiked dramatically, some by a factor of 10. Japanese manufacturers, especially in the electronics sector, were thrown into crisis. Officially, Beijing denied a political motive, but the message was clear: these materials can be turned into pressure tools. In 2019, during escalating US-China trade tensions, Chinese state media floated the idea of using rare earths as a countermeasure. They didn't need to act fully, the threat itself was leverage. Now, set this against the six-stage pattern we saw with coal, oil, and OPEC. Stage 1, resource discovery. Every time someone realizes that a particular material is not just useful, but foundational. Coal for engines and steel, oil for global mobility and mechanized war, rare earths for electronics, clean energy, and advanced weapons. Stage 2, infrastructure development. The country that moves first builds more than mines, it builds systems. Britain built railways, ports, and factory towns around coal. America built wells, refineries, gas stations, highways, and car-centric cities around oil. China has spent decades building mines, chemical separation plants, magnet factories, and state-supported research around rare earths, embedding them into its broader industrial policy. Stage 3, monopoly establishment. One player ends up with a dominant share of supply, not necessarily 100%, but enough to influence price and availability. Britain at one point produced over half the world's coal. The US produced similar shares of oil in the mid-20th century. OPEC at its height coordinated around 40% of oil production, but much more of the export market. China today doesn't just dominate production, it almost totally dominates processing, which is even more strategically important. That processing step is the choke point. You can dig ore out of the ground in the US or Australia, but most of it still has to be shipped to China to be turned into something factories can use. The result is a dependency more extreme than oil ever was. The US depends on China for roughly 80% of its rare earth imports. Europe's dependence is even higher. Japan, a high-tech powerhouse, is almost completely reliant. These figures are not just about trade ratios, they represent the ability or inability to manufacture core technologies. When one country controls the refineries, separation plants, and magnet factories, it controls the tap. China has already shown glimpses of how it can use this. In 2010, during a diplomatic clash with Japan over disputed islands, Chinese authorities quietly restricted rare earth exports to Japanese buyers. Prices spiked dramatically, some by a factor of 10. Japanese manufacturers, especially in the electronics sector, were thrown into crisis. Officially, Beijing denied a political motive, but the message was clear. These materials can be turned into pressure tools. In 2019, during escalating US-China trade tensions, Chinese state media floated the idea of using rare earths as a countermeasure. They didn't need to act fully, the threat itself was leverage. Now, set this against the six-stage pattern we saw with coal, oil, and OPEC. Stage 1, resource discovery. Every time someone realizes that a particular material is not just useful, but foundational. Coal for engines and steel, oil for global mobility and mechanized war, rare earths for electronics, clean energy, and advanced weapons. Stage 2, infrastructure development. The country that moves first builds more than mines, it builds systems. Britain built railways, ports, and factory towns around coal. America built wells, refineries, gas stations, highways, and car-centric cities around oil. China has spent decades building mines, chemical separation plants, magnet factories, and state-supported research around rare earths, embedding them into its broader industrial policy. Stage 3, monopoly establishment. One player ends up with a dominant share of supply, not necessarily 100%, but enough to influence price and availability. Britain at one point produced over half the world's coal. The US produced similar shares of oil in the mid-20th century. OPEC at its height coordinated around 40% of oil production, but much more of the export market. China today doesn't just dominate production, it almost totally dominates processing, which is even more strategically important. That processing step is the choke point. You can dig ore out of the ground in the US or Australia, but most of it still has to be shipped to China to be turned into something factories can use. The result is a dependency more extreme than oil ever was. The US depends on China for roughly 80% of its rare earth imports. Europe's dependence is even higher. Japan, a high-tech powerhouse, is almost completely reliant. These figures are not just about trade ratios, they represent the ability or inability to manufacture core technologies. When one country controls the refineries, separation plants, and magnet factories, it controls the tap. China has already shown glimpses of how it can use this. In 2010, during a diplomatic clash with Japan over disputed islands, Chinese authorities quietly restricted rare earth exports to Japanese buyers. Prices spiked dramatically, some by a factor of 10. Japanese manufacturers, especially in the electronics sector, were thrown into crisis. Officially, Beijing denied a political motive, but the message was clear. These materials can be turned into pressure tools. In 2019, during escalating US-China trade tensions, Chinese state media floated the idea of using rare earths as a countermeasure.
New processing facilities are expensive, technically complex, and politically sensitive due to environmental concerns. Realistically, even with aggressive investment, it could take until the mid-2030s for Western countries to develop a robust alternative. That lag creates a window, roughly a decade, during which China can use its position, knowing that others have nowhere else to go. Third, demand is exploding. Electric vehicles require far more rare earth-based magnets than conventional cars. Wind turbines for offshore farms consume massive quantities per unit. As governments push for decarbonization and digitalization simultaneously, the demand curve for rare earths is bending sharply upward.
By some estimates, it will triple by 2030. Rising demand into a controlled supply is the perfect recipe for leverage. Fourth, there is the explicit willingness to weaponize. Past behavior, export restrictions in 2010, threats in 2019, shows that Beijing sees these materials as a tool in strategic competition. As tensions rise over issues like Taiwan, semiconductor bans, and alliances in the Indo-Pacific, the probability that rare earths will be brought into the fight increases. Fifth, stockpiles tell you how seriously players take the threat. The United States has started building small strategic reserves, but they are nowhere near enough to sustain a prolonged cutoff, especially in wartime. China, meanwhile, has not only stockpiled, but also signed long-term deals with suppliers abroad, including in Africa and Asia, locking up future supply even beyond its borders. What would a full-scale rare earth cutoff look like? The consequences would ripple through daily life much faster than most people imagine. Smartphone makers would burn through inventories in months, new models would be delayed or canceled. Automakers would scramble to redesign motors or pause EV production entirely. Renewable energy projects would stall as turbine and generator manufacturers ran out of materials. The world's push toward green technology, already complicated, would slam into a hard physical limit. On the military side, the scenario is even more alarming. Programs like the F-35, missile defense systems, precision munitions, and advanced communications would face immediate constraints. Current hardware could still operate, but replacing losses, upgrading fleets, or expanding capacity in a crisis would be nearly impossible. In a long conflict, the side with secure access to rare earths would enjoy a decisive technological edge. Can we just innovate our way out? In the very long term, maybe. Researchers are working on magnets that use fewer or different rare materials, on alternative display technologies, and on better recycling methods. But we have to be honest about timescales. Material science breakthroughs do not move at the speed of app development. What sits in the lab this decade might reach large-scale commercialization in the next, if it ever does. Recycling is promising. Rare earths can, in principle, be recovered from old electronics and wind turbines, but the infrastructure is in its infancy, and the volumes currently recovered are tiny compared to annual demand. Right now, we mine rare earths, embed them in products, then dump them in landfills or ship e-waste abroad, often back to China, where whatever can be salvaged is salvaged and sold back to us. The deeper truth beneath all of this is uncomfortable. Western governments and corporations made a strategic decision, mostly by inertia and short-term profit motives, to let a rival power dominate a critical supply chain. It was cheaper to buy from China than to maintain messy mines and polluting processing plants at home. Quarterly earnings looked better. Environmental concerns were outsourced. The cost was hidden until now, when we realized that the savings came at the price of strategic dependence. China, for its part, did not stumble into this position. Leaders like Deng Xiaoping understood what they were doing. In the early 1990s, he famously remarked, "The Middle East has oil, China has rare earths." That was not idle rhetoric, it was a blueprint. Beijing spent decades turning that comparative advantage into structural power, subsidizing producers, tolerating environmental damage, buying up foreign deposits, and consolidating the industry under firms it could control. The result is a form of leverage similar to what Britain enjoyed with coal, what America enjoyed with oil, and what OPEC demonstrated with price. When we compare the four monopolies, British coal, American oil, OPEC oil, and Chinese rare earths, we see not just repetition, but acceleration. Britain's coal-fueled supremacy lasted about a century. America's pure oil dominance lasted a few decades after World War II. OPEC's shock-and-awe leverage peaked over roughly 15 years before alternatives and new producers softened its grip. China's rare earth dominance began to solidify around 2010 and is now past the 15-year mark. But instead of eroding, it is being reinforced by deliberate policy just as global demand soars. That makes this particular monopoly more embedded and potentially more enduring. 4 times control of a strategic resource has acted as a hidden scriptwriter for global power. Coal underwood the British Empire, oil underwood American hegemony. Oil again, via OPEC, shifted wealth and geopolitical importance to the Middle East. Now, rare earths are giving China a quiet hand on the future of technology, energy, and war. The pattern is the same: discovery, development, monopoly, dependency, leverage, and eventually some form of collapse or transition. But we are not yet at the collapse. We are living inside stage 5, where leverage is at its maximum, alternatives are not ready, and the monopoly holder knows it. Some people dismiss this as alarmism, insisting that markets self-correct, that globalization makes extreme actions too costly, that mutual dependence will restrain everyone. Those arguments sounded familiar in 1913, on the eve of World War I, when economists pointed to high levels of trade between Britain and Germany and concluded that a major conflict was irrational. They sounded familiar in the early 1970s, before the embargo, when Western policymakers assumed oil producers would never dare cut supply because they depended on Western customers. History doesn't promise that rational self-interest will always win. It only promises that when one side is structurally dependent, the other side has options. China understands this. The Pentagon understands this. The uncomfortable question is whether the general public and the politicians who answer to it really do. Because decoupling, diversifying supply, and rebuilding domestic capacity are not weekend projects. They're decade-long national efforts that require sacrifice and foresight. Exactly the traits democracies struggle to muster until a crisis hits. Right now, China has arranged the chessboard so that much of the developed world, from Silicon Valley to Stuttgart to Seoul, cannot move without passing through a bottleneck it controls. That's what a strategic resource monopoly looks like in the 21st century. It doesn't always announce itself with explosions. It just quietly determines who gets to grow, who gets to innovate, who gets to arm, and who has to ask permission. If this changes how you see your phone, your car, your country's energy policy, then remember the pattern. Coal, oil, oil again, now rare earths. 4 acts in a 300-year drama where the main character isn't a leader or a flag, but a resource in the ground and the network built around it. History has been warning us in plain sight. The only real question left is whether we treat rare earth dependence as just another headline or as the opening chapter in the next great struggle over who controls the foundations of modern life.